They thought the swamp would trap them. They thought the mud, the darkness, and the water would finish what the chains had started. 3 brothers ran with nothing left but each other and the will to survive. Behind them, hunters closed in with dogs, guns, and certainty. But that night, the swamp did not belong to the hunters. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shape the past. We truly appreciate every single one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about survival, courage, and brotherhood. So relax, settle in, and let us begin. The swamp stretched like a living maze across the lowlands, thick with cypress trees, hanging moss, and dark water that reflected almost nothing back to the eye. In the Deep South during the early 1850s, these swamps were both feared and respected. Even those who lived nearby rarely entered them without purpose. The ground could vanish beneath a single step. The water could rise without warning, and the silence, broken only by insects and distant splashes, carried a weight that made even strong men uneasy. But on that night, the swamp became something else. It became the last refuge for 3 brothers who had already outrun everything behind them except the one thing that refused to let them go: the hunt. Samuel, the eldest, moved first, pushing through thick reeds and tangled roots with a determination that came from years of quiet endurance. Behind him came Josiah, his breath heavy, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and anger that had been building for far too long. And last was Eli, younger, smaller, but driven by a will that refused to break even as his body struggled to keep up. They had not planned to enter the swamp. Their escape had been meant to follow a narrow path through wooded land, guided by whispered directions passed carefully from one trusted voice to another. But plans rarely survive the moment they are tested. The sound of dogs had come sooner than expected, sharp and relentless, cutting through the night with terrifying clarity. The hunters were close, closer than anyone had hoped. The brothers had reached the edge of the swamp with no time left to debate. Samuel had looked at the dark water, then back at his brothers, and made the only decision left to him: forward, into the unknown. The first step had been the hardest, the cold water rising around his legs, the mud pulling at his feet as if trying to hold him in place. But once that step was taken, there was no turning back. One by one they followed, disappearing into a world where the rules of the land no longer applied. Behind them, the hunters arrived at the edge of the swamp with far less hesitation. These were not ordinary men. They were experienced trackers, men who had spent years chasing others across difficult terrain. They trusted their dogs, trusted their weapons, trusted the belief that no one could outrun them for long. When they saw the footprints leading into the water, they did not stop. They saw desperation, not strategy. One of them laughed quietly, certain that the swamp would do most of the work for them. Another tightened his grip on the rope coiled at his side, already imagining the moment the brothers would be dragged back. The dogs barked louder, pulling against the restraints, eager to continue the chase. Without waiting, the hunters stepped forward, following the trail into the swamp, unaware that they had just crossed into a place where control could slip away without warning. Inside the swamp, the brothers moved carefully but quickly, guided by instinct and the faint understanding Samuel had gathered from stories whispered long ago. He knew the swamp could hide them, but only if they respected it. Every step had to be chosen. Every sound had to be measured. The water reached higher in some places, forcing them to wade slowly, while in others the ground rose just enough to allow quicker movement. Mosquitoes swarmed around them, biting at exposed skin, but they could not afford to react. The sound of the dogs grew louder, then strangely distant, then loud again as it echoed through the trees in confusing patterns. Eli stumbled once, falling to his knees as the mud gave way beneath him. but Josiah pulled him up immediately, his grip firm, his voice low and urgent. "Stay up, stay moving." Samuel did not look back, but he heard everything. The splashes, the breathing, the distant shouts, and beneath it all, something else. The swamp was not just quiet, it was watching. The deeper they moved into the swamp, the more the world behind them began to fade. The open land, the roads, the familiar sounds of life beyond the trees, all seemed to disappear, replaced by something thicker, heavier, almost alive. The air grew damp and harder to breathe, each step pulling more strength from their bodies as the mud clung to their legs and the water resisted their movement. Samuel slowed slightly, raising his hand to signal caution. The swamp was changing. The ground beneath them felt softer, less certain, and the trees grew closer together, their roots twisting above the surface like traps waiting to catch the careless. He turned his head just enough to speak in a low voice, telling his brothers to step where he stepped, to avoid the darker patches of water, to trust nothing that looked still. Josiah nodded, his jaw tight, while Eli focused on each movement with intense concentration, forcing himself to ignore the exhaustion building in his limbs. Behind them, the sounds of the chase continued, but something about those sounds had shifted. The dogs were no longer moving with the same steady rhythm. Their barking came in bursts now, uneven, uncertain, as if even they were beginning to question the ground beneath them. The hunters pressed forward, but their confidence began to show its first cracks. The swamp did not behave like the land they were used to. Tracks disappeared into water. Broken branches led nowhere. The dogs pulled in different directions, confused by scents that drifted and scattered across the damp air. One of the men cursed under his breath as his foot sank deep into the mud, forcing him to struggle free with a sharp pull. Another warned the others to spread out, but not too far, their voices carrying tension that had not been there before. They could still hear signs of movement ahead, faint splashes, the rustle of disturbed water, but the distance between them and their prey no longer felt predictable. The swamp twisted sound, bending it in strange ways, making it seem closer or farther than it truly was. One hunter paused, looking around with narrowed eyes as if trying to read the land itself. He had been in swamps before, but this felt different. This felt like stepping into something that did not want them there. Samuel sensed the shift before he saw it. The water ahead widened into a darker stretch, still and thick, with no clear path through. He stopped abruptly, forcing the others to halt behind him. For a moment they stood in silence, listening. The swamp responded with its usual quiet, broken only by distant movement and the faint hum of insects. But beneath that, Samuel felt something else, a warning. He crouched slowly, reaching down with a long branch he had picked up earlier, pressing it into the water ahead. The branch sank deeper than expected, disappearing into soft ground that would not support their weight. He pulled it back and moved slightly to the side, testing again. This time the branch met resistance. A narrow path hidden beneath the surface just firm enough to hold. He motioned for his brothers to follow closely, stepping carefully onto the barely visible trail. Each step had to be exact, too far to the left or right, and the ground would give way. Eli's breathing quickened as he realized how narrow their margin for survival had become. Josiah stayed close behind, his focus sharp, his earlier anger now replaced with something colder and more controlled. They moved slowly, silently, guided by Samuel's steady hand and quiet judgment. Behind them, the hunters reached the same stretch of water, but without the knowledge that now guided the brothers. One of the dogs lunged forward, pulling hard against its leash, eager to continue the chase. The hunter, holding it, stepped forward without testing the ground, his boots sinking instantly into the soft mud beneath the water. He stumbled, cursing loudly as he struggled to regain his balance. The second hunter tried to move around him, but his footing slipped as well, sending both men crashing into the dark water with a heavy splash. The dogs barked wildly, their movements frantic as they pulled in different directions, confused and agitated. The third hunter shouted orders, trying to regain control, But the swamp did not respond to authority. It responded to missteps. And now those missteps were beginning to multiply. The noise they created echoed through the trees, loud and chaotic, a sharp contrast to the careful silence of the three brothers moving steadily ahead. For the first time since the chase began, the advantage had shifted. The hunters were no longer closing in. They were falling behind. The swamp grew darker the deeper they moved, not just from the fading night, but from the thick canopy above that blocked what little light remained. The trees leaned inward, their branches heavy with hanging moss that brushed against faces and shoulders like unseen hands. The air felt heavier here, harder to breathe, thick with moisture in the scent of still water. Samuel continued forward, slower now, more deliberate, his eyes scanning every inch of ground before placing his foot down. He could feel the swamp shifting beneath them, not in movement, but in presence, as if they had crossed into a part of it that did not forgive mistakes. Behind him, Josiah and Eli followed in silence, their earlier fear beginning to change into something else. Not comfort, not safety, but understanding. The swamp was not just hiding them, it was confusing the men behind them. And that confusion was growing. Samuel suddenly raised his hand again, signaling them to stop. Ahead, the land opened slightly into a shallow stretch of water broken by clusters of roots rising like islands. The path forward was not clear, but it was not impossible. He crouched low, studying the water, watching how it moved, how it settled around certain points. Then he turned slightly and whispered for them to spread out, not far, but enough to avoid stepping in the exact same place. It was a risk, but a necessary one. If they left too clear a trail, the hunters might regain direction. Josiah understood immediately, moving to the left with careful steps, while Eli stayed slightly to the right, his movement slower but controlled. Samuel remained between them, guiding with quiet gestures, ensuring they stayed within sight of one another. They moved like this for several minutes, each step breaking the pattern that trackers depended on. Their footprints would no longer form a single line. Their path would no longer be obvious. The swamp would take the rest. Behind them, the hunters struggled to regain control of the chase. Wet, frustrated, and now cautious, they moved more slowly than before. The dogs, once certain and aggressive, had become restless and confused, pulling in different directions, whining at scents that no longer made sense. One hunter tried to force them forward, but the animals resisted, their instincts warning them of something the men refused to fully accept. The tracks had begun to disappear. What had once been a clear trail had turned into scattered signs, broken water, disturbed mud that led nowhere. One of the men knelt down, trying to read the ground, but the swamp offered no clear answers. Every step the brothers had taken was being softened, blurred, erased by the water itself. The hunter stood slowly, his expression tightening as he realized what was happening. They were losing the trail. The advantage they had carried into the swamp was slipping away, replaced by uncertainty that grew heavier with each passing moment. Then the swamp answered again. One of the hunters, moving too quickly despite the warning signs, stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground. For a brief second it held. Then it gave way. His leg plunged deep into the mud, pulling him down with sudden force. He shouted, struggling to pull himself free, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank. The other two rushed to help, grabbing his arms, pulling with all their strength as the mud resisted, thick and unyielding. The dogs barked wildly, circling in panic, their noise echoing through the trees in sharp, chaotic bursts. It took all three men working together to free him, dragging him back onto firmer ground, his clothes soaked, his breath heavy with fear and anger. For the first time, none of them spoke. The realization did not need words. The swamp was no longer just difficult terrain. It was dangerous, and it was winning. Ahead, the brothers paused briefly, listening. The noise behind them had changed. It was no longer the steady pursuit they had feared. It was scattered, strained, uncertain. Samuel allowed himself a single breath of relief, but only a small one. The swamp had given them an opening, but it would not protect them forever. They needed to go deeper, to reach a place where the land itself would hide them completely. He turned to his brothers, his voice low but firm, telling them they were not done yet. Josiah nodded, his expression focused, his earlier anger now replaced by determination. Eli, though exhausted, straightened slightly, pushing through the pain in his legs. They moved forward again, disappearing further into the tangled maze of water and roots. Behind them, the hunters stood in the dark, surrounded by a land that no longer belonged to them, slowly beginning to understand that this chase had become something else entirely. The swamp tightened around them as if it had been waiting for this moment. The water grew deeper in places, rising to their knees, then to their thighs, while the ground beneath shifted between firm patches and sudden drops that threatened to pull them under. The trees stood closer now, their thick trunks forming narrow corridors that twisted in unpredictable directions. The air carried a strange stillness, heavier than before, as though even the insects had grown quiet. Samuel slowed again, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. They had reached a part of the swamp where movement alone would not be enough. This was where decisions mattered most. He looked ahead and saw what he had been searching for. A cluster of cypress roots rising above the water, large enough to hold their weight, tangled enough to hide them from view. It was not an escape, but it was something else. A place to stop, to think, to turn the chase in a different direction. He guided his brothers toward the roots, stepping carefully until they reached the raised ground. From there, they could see just enough through the trees to track movement without being seen easily. Samuel lowered himself into a crouch and motioned for silence. The sounds behind them had grown louder again, not closer in distance, but sharper in tension. The hunters were still coming, but not with the same confidence they had before. They moved slower now, calling out to one another more often, their voices edged with frustration. The dogs barked less frequently, their earlier aggression replaced by hesitation. Josiah leaned closer, whispering that they could keep moving, that they might still outrun them completely. But Samuel shook his head. Running had brought them this far, but running alone would not end the chase. The swamp had already begun to work in their favor. Now they needed to let it do more. Behind them, the hunters pushed forward with growing unease. Every step felt uncertain, every sound harder to trust. One of them suggested turning back, his voice low, almost reluctant. But the idea was quickly rejected. Pride, anger, and the fear of returning empty-handed drove them forward. They had come too far to leave without something to show for it. Yet even as they continued, their movements betrayed doubt. They tested the ground more often, paused more frequently, and spoke in quieter tones as if the swamp itself might be listening. The dogs, once leading the way, now stayed closer to their handlers, their ears alert, their bodies tense. The trail was nearly gone. What remained was only a sense of direction, a belief that the brothers were still ahead, somewhere in the maze of water and trees. That belief was the only thing keeping them moving. Samuel watched them approach through the narrow openings between the trees. He could see the way they moved, cautious now, uncertain. He could hear the strain in their voices, the frustration building beneath their control. He turned to his brothers and spoke quietly, explaining what they needed to do. They would not run, they would wait. The swamp would carry their scent, distort their sound, and confuse their path. If they remained still, if they trusted the land instead of fighting it, the hunters would begin to lose direction completely. It was a risk, but so was everything else they had done. Josiah hesitated for a moment, his instincts still pushing him toward action, but then he nodded. Eli said nothing, but his eyes showed understanding. They settled into silence, their bodies still, their breathing controlled, becoming part of the swamp rather than something moving through it. The hunters passed closer than expected, their figures emerging through the trees, their lantern casting weak light across the water. For a brief moment, it seemed as if they might see the brothers, might notice the shapes hidden among the roots. One of them stopped, turning his head slowly, listening. The swamp held its breath. The water barely moved. Even the faint sounds of insects seemed to fade. Then, without finding what he was searching for, the hunter turned away. They continued forward, deeper into the swamp, following a path that no longer existed. Their voices grew fainter as they moved, their directions slowly shifting away from the place where the brothers remained hidden. Minutes passed, then more. The sounds of the chase did not return. The swamp had taken them in a different direction, one that would not lead back easily. Samuel waited longer, making sure the silence was real, not temporary. Only when he was certain did he finally move, rising slowly and signaling his brothers to follow. They stepped down from the roots and turned in the opposite direction, moving carefully but with new purpose. The swamp no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a shield. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, the hunters were still searching, still calling out, still trying to regain control of a chase they had already lost. And ahead, for the first time since they had begun to run, there was something else waiting. Not certainty, not safety, but a path that no longer led back. The swamp did not release its grip easily, especially on those who did not understand it. The hunters moved deeper without realizing it, their sense of direction slowly unraveling with each step. What had once felt like forward progress now circled back on itself. The same twisted trees appeared again. The same patches of dark water reflected their lantern light in familiar ways. One of the men stopped suddenly, turning in place as he tried to recognize something, anything that could guide them back. But the swamp did not offer clear signs. It erased them. The dogs, once eager and loud, had grown quiet, their movements uncertain, their noses no longer able to follow a trail that had been swallowed by water and time. Frustration turned to anger, and anger slowly gave way to something deeper, something harder to admit. They were lost. The realization settled heavily between them, unspoken at first, then voiced in sharp, tense exchanges that carried through the still air. The hunt was over, but they had not accepted it yet. Far from them, moving carefully in the opposite direction, the three brothers continued through the swamp with a different kind of awareness. Samuel no longer rushed. He moved with patience, reading the land in ways that came from instinct and careful observation. He watched how the water flowed, how the trees thinned in certain directions, how the ground rose just enough to suggest firmer paths ahead. Josiah followed closely, his earlier urgency replaced by focus, while Eli, though exhausted, matched their pace with quiet determination. The sounds behind them had faded completely now. No barking, no shouting, no movement that suggested pursuit. Still, Samuel did not allow them to relax. The swamp was not finished with them yet. It demanded respect until the very end. He led them toward a stretch where the trees began to space out slightly, where the water grew shallower and the ground beneath felt more solid with each step. It was not obvious, not something a stranger would notice. But to Samuel, it was enough. They were nearing the edge. Back in the depths of the swamp, the hunters faced a different reality. Their lantern burned lower, its light weaker, casting long, uncertain shadows that made every movement harder to trust. One of the men insisted they should turn back, retrace their steps, but the others argued that they had already lost that path. Every direction looked the same now. Every choice felt like a guess. The swamp had taken their certainty and replaced it with doubt. One of the dogs let out a low whine, pulling back instead of forward, its instincts now pushing against the men who held its leash. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the swamp itself had closed in around them. They began to move more cautiously, not in pursuit, but in search of a way out. The hunt that had begun with confidence had turned into something else entirely. Survival. And in that shift, the balance of power had fully changed. At the edge of the swamp, the brothers emerged slowly, almost cautiously, as if expecting the land to pull them back in. The ground beneath their feet felt different, firmer, more certain. The trees thinned, allowing more light to break through the canopy above. The air moved more freely, carrying the scent of open land rather than still water. For a moment, none of them spoke. They simply stood there, breathing, listening, making sure it was real. Then Eli let out a quiet, almost disbelieving breath. They had made it. Not through strength alone, not through speed, but through something else entirely. Through trust, through patience, through understanding that survival sometimes meant letting the world around you become your ally. Samuel looked back once toward the dark wall of trees behind them. Somewhere inside, the hunters were still moving, still trying to find their way out. But the swamp no longer concerned him. It had done what it needed to do. As the sun began to rise, casting the first light of morning across the land, the brothers turned away from the swamp and began walking toward the unknown. They did not know exactly where they would go next. They did not know what dangers still waited ahead. But they knew one thing with certainty. They were no longer being chased. The hunt had ended in a way no one had expected. The hunters had entered the swamp believing it would trap their prey. Instead, it had trapped them. And the three brothers, once running for their lives, now walked forward with something they had not felt since before the chains. A chance. The story did not stay in the swamp. It moved the way stories always do in places where truth must travel quietly, carried by voices that understand both its power and its danger. It began with small details. A hunter returning late, soaked and shaken, speaking less than expected. Another arriving days later with little to say except that the swamp had turned against them. No captured men, no reward, no victory to report. That alone was enough to raise questions. In towns and along dirt roads, people began to whisper. Something had gone wrong. Something had not followed the usual pattern. For those who depended on control, that kind of uncertainty was unsettling. But for others, those who lived under that control, it meant something else entirely. It meant that for once, the story had ended differently. Among enslaved communities, the tale grew carefully, shaped by each telling but anchored in the same truth. Three brothers had run. They had been chased into the swamp, and they had not been caught. Some said the swamp itself had hidden them, confusing the dogs and swallowing their trail. Others said the brothers had known the land in a way the hunters never could. The details changed depending on who spoke, but the meaning remained strong. It was not just a story of escape. It was a story of survival against odds that were meant to be impossible. It was a reminder that even in a world designed to close every path, some paths still existed. Hidden, difficult, but real. The story was never spoken loudly. It did not need to be. Its strength lived in quiet understanding, in the way it settled into the minds of those who heard it. The hunters, for their part, did not forget what had happened. When they finally found their way out of the swamp, it was not with pride or confidence, but with a silence that spoke louder than any story they might have told. They avoided speaking about the details, avoided admitting how completely the land had taken control of the situation. But the change in them was visible. They moved more cautiously in the months that followed. They hesitated at the edges of unfamiliar terrain. They listened more closely when warnings were given. The swamp had not just slowed them. It had taught them something they could not ignore. Not every place could be controlled. Not every chase could be won. As for the brothers, their journey continued beyond the swamp, into a world still filled with danger, but no longer defined by pursuit. They moved carefully, relying on the same instincts that had carried them through the night. Along the way, they found moments of help, small acts of kindness offered quietly by those who understood what they had risked. Food shared without question, directions given in low voices, shelter offered for a single night before moving on again. Each step carried them farther from the life they had left behind, though the memory of it remained close. They did not speak often about the swamp, but they did not need to. It lived in the way they moved, in the way they trusted each other, in the understanding that they had survived something that had been meant to end them. Over time, the story of the three brothers became something more than an event. It became a symbol, not of defiance alone, but of the power of unity and awareness. They had not survived because one was stronger than the others. They had survived because they stayed together, because they listened, because they adapted. That lesson traveled with the story, carried forward into other lives, other journeys, other moments where choices had to be made in the face of fear. The swamp, once seen only as a place of danger, became something different in those quiet retellings. It became a place where the balance had shifted, where the hunted had become unseen, and where survival had taken root in the most unlikely ground. Years passed, but the story never faded. It settled into memory the way roots settle into soil, quiet but strong, holding its place even as time moved forward. The swamp remained where it had always been, stretching across the lowlands, dark and watchful, unchanged in its appearance, yet forever marked by what had happened within it. Those who lived nearby still spoke of it carefully, not as a place to be conquered, but as a place to be respected. And when the story of the three brothers was told, it was never told as something ordinary. It was told as something rare, a moment when everything that was supposed to happen did not happen. A moment when the outcome shifted, not through luck, but through choice, unity, and understanding. The brothers themselves became part of that quiet legacy. Their names were not written in records, and their journey did not appear in official accounts, but they lived on in the way their story was carried. Some said they reached freedom far to the north. Others believed they remained hidden within communities that protected them, building new lives in places where their past could not easily follow. The truth of where they ended mattered less than the truth of what they had done. They had refused to be separated. They had trusted each other when fear could have broken them apart. And when they were pushed into a place meant to end them, they had listened, adapted, and survived. That lesson stayed alive in every retelling, passed quietly from one voice to another, shaping the way others thought about their own chances, their own choices. In the years that followed, as tensions across the nation grew and the foundations of the system began to crack, stories like theirs became part of something larger. They were reminders that resistance did not always look the same. Sometimes it was loud and visible. Sometimes it was silent and unseen. But it was always present. The story of the swamp carried a particular kind of strength. It showed that survival was not only about fighting harder or running faster. It was about understanding the world around you, about knowing when to move and when to remain still, about trusting those beside you even when everything else felt uncertain. These were lessons that reached beyond that single night, beyond that single place, into a broader understanding of what it meant to endure. One evening, long after the night of the chase, an old man sat near the edge of a different stretch of land, far from the swamp, but not far from its memory. He spoke quietly to a small group gathered around him, telling a story about three brothers who had once been hunted and had walked into darkness without knowing what waited inside. He described the sound of dogs, the weight of fear, the way the land itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. And then he spoke of how they had stayed together, how they had listened, how they had trusted something beyond fear. The listeners leaned in, not because the story was new, but because it carried something they needed to hear. When the man finished, he looked at them for a long moment and said that the world will always try to tell you where you cannot go, what you cannot survive, who you cannot be. But sometimes, if you hold on to each other, if you move with wisdom instead of panic, you will find that even the darkest places can lead you forward. And so the story endured. Not in books, not in official history, but in memory, in quiet voices, in the understanding passed from one generation to the next. On one night in the early 1850s, three brothers were chased into a swamp with the intention of never leaving it alive. But what happened next was something the hunters never expected. The swamp did not claim them. It did not betray them. Instead, it became their shield, their guide, and their escape. And in that moment, hidden beneath trees and water and darkness, the balance shifted just enough to remind the world that even in its harshest forms, it cannot fully control those who refuse to give up. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and like the channel so more hidden stories from the past can be told. And always remember, history is not only written in power, it is carried in survival, in unity, and in the quiet strength of those who found a way forward when none was meant to exist. Part 8. Time carried the story forward the way it always does, quietly, steadily, shaping it without ever erasing its truth. The land changed, the years moved, and the world that once hunted men through swamps and forests began to shift under the weight of growing conflict. But even as history unfolded in larger, louder ways, the story of the three brothers remained alive in quieter spaces. It was told in cabins late at night, in hushed voices between trusted friends, in moments where fear needed to be answered with something stronger. It was not told as legend alone. It was told as proof. Proof that survival was possible even when the odds were meant to be final. In those retellings, new details sometimes appeared, shaped by imagination or memory, but the heart of the story never changed. Three brothers entered the swamp together. They did not break apart. They did not panic when the darkness closed around them. They listened. They adapted. They trusted each other. And because of that, they walked out while those who chased them lost their way. That lesson became more important with each passing year. It was not just about escape. It was about how to survive in a world that constantly shifted, a world where danger did not always come from one direction, and safety was never guaranteed. The swamp became a symbol in those conversations, not just of danger, but of possibility. A place where the rules of the outside world did not always apply. For some, the story sparked quiet courage. It encouraged others to take chances they might not have considered before, to move carefully, to plan, to trust in something beyond fear. Not every attempt ended the same way. Many faced consequences that were harsh and unforgiving. But the story still mattered. It reminded people that even in the darkest conditions, the outcome was not always certain. That uncertainty became a form of strength. It gave space for hope to exist where it had once been pushed out completely. And hope, even in small amounts, can change the way people see the world around them. The swamp itself remained unchanged, silent and watchful as it had always been. Those who passed near it in later years sometimes felt something they could not explain, a sense that the place held more than just water and trees. It held memory. It held stories that could not be seen but could still be felt. And among those stories, the night of the three brothers stood out. Not because it was the only one, but because it showed something rare. It showed that even when everything seemed lost, there were still moments where the world could shift in unexpected ways. And so the story continued to travel, carried not by those who sought recognition, but by those who understood its meaning. It moved through generations, through changing times, through new struggles and new hopes. It remained a quiet reminder that survival is not always about strength alone. It is about awareness, unity, and the courage to move forward even when the path is unclear. The three brothers were never meant to leave that swamp alive. That was the plan. That was the certainty of the hunters. But what happened instead became something far greater than a single escape. It became a lasting truth. That even in a world built to confine, there are places where freedom can still be found.